Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Just trying to adjust my screen so I get the right view. Can't do it, never mind. Ladies and gentlemen, my focus as a writer for the last 25 years has been on the fate of the human species. I've been writing about scientific aspects of the 10 megathreats which now are bearing down on humanity. This morning, I'm going to talk about just one of those threats, that is the poisoning of the planet and the desperate need for us to clean it up. Basically, as we look at our future, there are just a number of these huge things bearing down on us. We all know about climate change. We know about the threat of nuclear war. But there are many other threats which are riding under the radar at the moment, and they require solution equally urgently. So let me start my talk today. Earth and all life on it are being saturated with man-made chemicals in an event unlike anything which has occurred in all 4 billion years of our planet's story. Every moment of our lives, from conception to death, we are exposed to thousands of substances, some lethal in even tiny doses, and most of them unknown in their effects on our health and our well-being and upon the natural world. These enter our bodies with every breath, each meal or drink, the clothes we wear, the products we adorn ourselves with, our homes, our workplaces and furniture, the things we encounter every day. There is no escaping them. This has happened in barely a single lifetime, so fast that while many people are conscious of specific issues like pesticides and air pollution, most people have little notion of the universal spread of contamination, the colossal volumes involved, or of the multiple impacts which tens of thousands of contaminants acting in combination may be having on our bodies and our minds, or of the risks which this now poses to human life and indeed the whole Earth system, now and for centuries to come. Humanity currently manufactures around about 350,000 different chemicals. The US Health Department states that around 85,000 chemicals are used in that country alone, and each year an estimated 2,000 new ones are being introduced for use in everyday items such as foods, personal care products, prescription drugs, household cleaners, and lawn care products. The United Nations Environment Programme cautions that few of these chemicals have ever been properly tested for health or environmental safety. Global output of industrial chemicals has more than doubled since 2000 to around 2.5 billion tonnes per year, and it is forecast to triple by the mid-century. However, these purposefully designed substances are the mere tip of the iceberg of total human chemical emissions. I mean, for example, we produce 11 billion tonnes of garbage every single year. Our cities are just flooded with waste matter. We produce 150 million tonnes of nitrogen and 11 million tonnes of phosphorus used in chemical fertilizers and from the burning of fossil fuels and waste disposal. 400 million tonnes of hazardous waste, including 50 million tonnes of old computers and mobile phones. And this has grown from just 1 million tonnes in 25 years. In all, we produce about 15 billion tonnes of coal, oil and gas every year, which of course contributes the lion's share of 50 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide to our atmosphere. We generate 72 billion tonnes of minerals, metals and materials every year, and that produces up to 1 trillion tonnes of rock, soil, tailings, overburden, acid runoff and slags from mining. Producing our food or building our cities generates 75 billion tonnes of eroded topsoil. Now, this chemical flood, which I estimate totals more than 220 billion tonnes or gigatons per year, constitutes by far humanity's greatest impact on the planet and on life on it. all life on it in the Anthropocene, which is the age of human impacts. It is 5 times the scale of our climate emissions. Yet it's not getting 5 times the attention, is it? Its sheer size and its global ramifications, it is the most underrated, underinvestigated, and poorly understood of all the existential risks facing humans in the 21st century. Science documents man-made chemicals moving relentlessly around the Earth in water, air, soil, wildlife, fish, food, in trade, in people, and in our genes. These substances move constantly in both space and time. They travel on the wind, in water, attached to soil, in dust, in plastic particles, in wildlife, in food and traded goods, in and on people. They combine and recombine with one another and with naturally occurring substances, giving rise to generations of new compounds, some more toxic, others less. Most completely unknown. They leapfrog around the planet in cycles of absorption and re-release, which are known as the grasshopper effect. Many of these substances, especially heavy metals, last for generations, creating a cumulative toxic load in the environment and in our bodies. Their effects are, even now, being passed on to future generations of humans in our genes. Researchers are finding man-made toxins in the stratosphere, where it is responsible for a pandemic of skin cancers. From the peak of Mount Everest, where the fresh snow is too polluted to drink, to the Amazon jungle, to the remotest atolls, the continental shelves, the ocean deeps, from the high Arctic to the pristine Antarctic, in the filthy grey-brown cloud of toxins and particulates that has settled across industrial Asia, from Mecca to New Delhi to Beijing. Cancer-causing flame retardants and the mercury emitted by coal burning have been found by researchers worldwide in wild birds, in fish, seals, whales, deep-sea squid, polar bears, and in life forms in the remotest corners of the world, where they never come into direct contact with humans. These substances are routinely detected throughout the global food chain, in our drinking water from rivers and aquifers beneath our cities and farms, in the very air we breathe, especially indoors. Pardon me, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to pause it because I seem to have lost the video, and I just need to find out whether you're still receiving me.
Hi, Julie. Are you trying to get your screen shared?
Yeah, I seem to have lost the.
Yeah. So at the bottom of the Zoom window, there's a share screen icon, the green button. Oh, there you go. Then hit play from. Oh, great. Yeah.
Okay, so we're still in contact. I just lost the Zoom link, it seemed. Anyway, worldwide, more than 760 dead zones, comprising 1/10 of the world's oceans, have been found. Now, these are places where the oxygen has been stripped from the water and sea life lost due to the outpouring of fertilizers, sediment, pesticides, and oil spills. Half of the world's greatest living organism, the Great Barrier Reef of Australia, was lost in the last 30 years, and 93% of the remainder has suffered dire effects from human chemical insights. And that includes the CO2 that is causing climate warming, nutrients, pesticides, and sediment in runoff. Tests suggest that the typical modern citizen is a walking contaminated site. The US Centers for Disease Control, for example, conducts a regular survey of 212 industrial chemicals of concern in a sample of about 2,000 Americans. It finds flame retardants in the blood of almost every person it examines. BPA from plastic drink bottles in more than 90%, and the non-stick coating chemical, PFOA, in most individuals. We are all being poisoned by the polluted air we breathe, whether outdoors, indoors, or in our cars. Pardon me. The Environmental Working Group in independent tests found 414 industrial toxins in the blood of people, ranging in age from newborn to grandparents. It found 232 industrial chemicals, including dioxins, flame retardants, and known carcinogens in the blood of newborn babies and minority ethnic groups who were contaminated while still in the womb. Recent science reports that the first poo that a baby takes after it is born is loaded with microscopic pieces of plastic that is acquired through its mother. Thereafter, the baby continues to shit plastic that it is ingested from its drinking bottles, its blankets, its synthetic clothes and toys. The World Health Organization reports the finding of toxic contaminants in mother's milk in 68 different countries, with the highest levels in India, the Netherlands, and Belgium. An American study found traces of rocket fuel in every commercial sample of infant formula it tested. After weaning, the assault continues. Around 4,000 to 6,000 different chemicals, mostly pesticides, preservatives, additives, and dyes, are regularly used in the growing, processing, and packaging of modern industrial food. And think about walking down those long aisles in the supermarket, all those brightly coloured lollies, sweets, and things like that. You know, they're all made from oil or coal or something like that. A lot of those dyes. Many of these things have not been assessed for their safety, especially in children who are more vulnerable than adults. And nobody can yet say what their combined effect on human health will be. These effects also are literally cradle to grave. An Australian study shows that even when dead and buried, we give back our accumulated poisons to future generations as they leach out of our tissues into the groundwater. The World Health Organization and UNEP estimate that about 12.6 million people are dying from environmental poisons, and 86 million are being disabled every year. That doesn't include several million more cases where chemicals have been implicated in cancers, or uncounted lethal cases of heart disease, obesity, or brain disorders. So who now estimates 1 in 4 of every death globally is due to chemical exposure in our environment, sometimes acute, but mostly chronic. This far exceeds the annual death tolls from malaria, car crashes, and HIV/AIDS. It is the worst case of mass homicide in human history. It is twice as bad as the death toll in World War II. The full impact of this universal chemical suffusion is not clear, but suspicions are affirming. Medical science is reporting unexplained increases in previously unknown or once rare conditions whose modern upsurge is increasingly being linked by researchers to rising rates of multiple chemical exposure across the entire population. Such conditions include many forms of cancer, diabetes, obesity, child development disorders, reproductive disorders, brain and nervous diseases, multiple chemical sensitivities, chronic fatigue syndrome, heart disease. In 2006, and again in 2004, Harvard professors Philippe Grandjean and Philip Landrigan warned in The Lancet of a silent pandemic of neurotoxicity affecting millions of children worldwide. They noted that over 200 chemicals are known to cause such effects, and that, quote, untested chemicals should not be presumed to be safe to brain development, and chemicals in existing use and all new chemicals must therefore be tested for developmental neurotoxicity. Now, they've been warning about this for nigh on 20 years. Nothing has happened. Nothing has happened. We're still poisoning the brains of a generation of young children worldwide. Now, backing up their hypothesis was the finding by the US Centers for Disease Control that 1 in 6 American children now suffer a developmental disorder. I'm citing America because that's simply because America has the best data, but you can take it as read that other countries around the world have equally grave statistics. Studies in Europe, Asia, and North America put the prevalence of autism at 1 in 100 and as high as 1 in 59 children in the USA. Several epidemiological studies find that mothers living in industrial areas close to heavy traffic are twice as likely to have an autistic child as those living in healthier places. In a recent report on endocrine disrupting chemicals, the World Health Organization and UNEP warned that reproductive and other hormonal disorders are on the rise globally, that man-made substances are implicated by more and more laboratory studies, and the scale of the problem is probably underestimated. And as somebody who reads an awful lot of the scientific literature on this sort of thing, I can tell you those studies are multiplying by the year. There are tens of thousands of studies now linking man-made chemicals with various health conditions. Now, it's a very alarming picture if you put the pieces together, but unfortunately nobody is. Sperm counts in Western men have more than halved. Reduced female fertility, adverse pregnancy outcomes, genital deformities, changes in gender and sexual preference are all now thought to have links to man-made chemicals, which are scrambling our hormones. The UN warns this. Endocrine disruptors have also been linked in several scientific studies with the worldwide pandemic of obesity. Two vital points emerge. First of all, this chemical assault is quite new. Mostly it has just occurred in the last 50 years. It is something that our ancestors never had to deal with. Second, its impacts are for the most part preventable and avoidable. The question is, does society wish to prevent them? Every year, as we heard, about 2,000 new chemicals are being released onto world markets, most without proper health, safety, or environmental screening. Now, regulation has so far banned just 19 out of 350,000 chemicals in a handful of countries. Right? At that rate of progress, it's going to take us 1/3 of a million years, which is longer than the entire existence of Homo sapiens, to process all the chemicals that we're producing at the moment. Clearly, national regulation holds few answers to what is now an out-of-control global problem. Furthermore, the chemical industry is relocating out of the developed world, where it is generally quite well regulated and observes some ethical standards, and into developing countries, mainly in Asia, where it is largely beyond the reach of the law, and I might add, where officialdom is readily corrupted. However, its toxic emissions are returning to citizens in well-regulated countries, in wind, water, food, wildlife, consumer goods, industrial products, and people. So even if you've got really good laws, they don't protect you, not from this flood of toxins, which is on the wind and in trade and things like that. Furthermore, the chemicals that we emit, intentionally or unintentionally, then go on to interact with tens of thousands of other compounds in our environment and daily intake to potentially form billions of toxic mixtures. The effects of these mixtures are very poorly understood at the moment. Science is really only just starting out to understand what happens when you hit somebody with 10,000 different substances. And these mixtures cannot be controlled by regulation. Now, the world awoke to the risks of chemical contamination when Rachel Carson published Silent Spring over half a century ago in 1962, where she specifically warned about certain persistent pesticides used in agriculture. Since her book came out, the volume of pesticides in use worldwide has increased tenfold, this is in agriculture, to around 5 million tonnes a year. Now, don't get me wrong, chemicals and minerals are valuable and extremely useful. They do a great deal of good, they save many lives and much money. No one is suggesting they should all be banned, but their value may count for little if the current uncontrolled, unmonitored, unregulated, and unconscionable mass release and planetary saturation continues. Since the poisoning of the people of Minamata in Japan with toxic mercury in the 1950s, there has been a string of high-profile chemical scandals. The Love Canal, Seveso, Bhopal, Erin Brockovich, most recently Fukushima, Tianjin, and the Indian school lunch tragedy. The one thing that these events mostly have in common is that the onus of proof is on the victims to prove that they have been harmed and show how. Rarely, if ever, are industry and government held accountable or obliged to show that chemical processes are safe or harmless. Consequently, there is now an unproductive confrontation between angry, frightened citizens and industry and regulators. This leads to long drawn out legal battles that deliver justice to nobody. An important point in my book is that blaming industry and calling for tougher regulation will not solve the problem of the poisoned planet. We need a smarter way to protect society and all future generations from the toxic flood. And this starts with recognizing that we are the ones responsible. We are the ones who generate the market signals that lead to the mass production and ill-considered release of toxins. Every act of consumption on a crowded planet has chemical consequences. Please bear that in mind whenever you buy anything. Every dollar we spend sends a signal to a string of industries which emit a mass of chemicals, either as products or as toxic waste into our environment. Those innocent dollar signals are killing 12 million people a year, a new Holocaust every 6 months. In a sense, we are all getting away with murder. This uncomfortable thought is essential to modern society taking effective action to clean up the earth and to protect our children into the future. If we have given rise to the problem by demanding goods which are produced using toxic substances or with toxic processes, then we alone have the power to correct it. It is already clear that governments do not have the capacity or the will to regulate a global toxic flood. Indeed, many governments, if not most, are in the pockets of the global petrochemical and fossil fuels industry. Regulation is important, don't get me wrong, but if we rely on rules alone to protect our children, the evidence is that they will not succeed. In a globalized world, only we, the people, are powerful enough as consumers to send the market signals to industry to cease toxic emissions and to properly reward industry for producing clean, safe, healthy products and services. For the first time in human history, we have the means to share a universal understanding of a common threat and what we can each do to mitigate it. Through the internet and social media, concerned citizens and parents are already mobilizing around the world. This conference is an example of that process in action. We are reaching out to one another across borders, cultural, ethnic, religious, linguistic, and economic divides. Good, concerned people are joining hands at light speed to cleanse our poisoned planet. Now, this is an expression of people power and global democracy like none before it. The organisations on this slide, for example, have a combined membership of more than 55 million people. Many more are sharing knowledge, advice, ideas about how to protect our children and clean up society through their own networks. For example, I myself follow renewable and regenerative farming discourse around the world on social media. It's stunning. Ideas are flowing at the speed of light among farmers around the world on how to produce food cleanly, safely, and environmentally soundly. In a technique known as distributed action, organisations like 350.org have assembled a worldwide protest movement of more than 1 million people. This is a short step from protesting about carbon to protesting about toxic chemistry. Now, there are many exciting new technologies and approaches being trialled to clean up our planet. And as somebody who's worked with the scientists who are operating in this area for more than 20 years, I know, I've spoken to them at international forums and conferences and things like that. There's some wonderful ideas out there for how you clean up this mess. Green chemistry, industrial ecology, cradle-to-cradle manufacturing, product stewardship, and zero waste. Those are just some of the more high-profile ones. But we have to find ways to encourage industry to adopt. And the most effective of these are consumer-generated market signals. Far from being harmful to industry, this universal demand for clean, safe products will open fresh markets. It will create new jobs, build new companies, and generate greater prosperity. Now, we're already seeing it happen in the energy space, in transport. Electric vehicles, renewable energy and things like that are taking off. Now, we need a similar revolution in the area of all kinds of manufacturing and processing, especially food. We need renewable food now. There are 10 ways in which we can all contribute to unpoisoning our world. And this is my 10-point plan. You can find a lot more details in the book. First of all, we need to form a partnership. All the organizations on Earth who are interested or concerned about this issue need to join hands. There's no good battling on in our own little bailiwicks and corners. We have to form a global movement of people. Otherwise, we will not be heard by these very large corporations that are, in most cases, bigger than countries. Second, we need to demand a new human right not to be poisoned, and I will discuss that shortly. Third, we need to eliminate coal, oil, gas, and all forms of fossil fuels straight away. Really, certainly by 2030. Now, we need to do that for climate anyway. Otherwise, the climate is going to render the Earth uninhabitable by the end of this century. But the second reason we want to do it is that most of the poisons are made from these things. And if we get rid of them, then we have got rid of the major source of poisoning on the planet. Most of the pharmaceuticals, the chemicals, the industrial chemicals and so on are made from oil or coal. So, if we solve that one, then we have reduced poisoning more than somewhat. We need to ask our doctors to adopt preventative healthcare. I mean, at the moment, doctors are a little better than salespeople for the global pharmaceutical company, which in turn is the handmaid of the petrochemical industry. So we need, instead of treating people with chemical diseases with new chemicals to try and cure them, we need to stop the diseases in the first place. I mean, it's absolutely obvious we need a preventative model in Western medicine and universal medicine. The next thing is that we need to train our young scientists as we train our young doctors. First, do no harm. That is the Hippocratic Oath that every young medical graduate takes when they leave their university. First, do no harm. But chemists, don't take such an oath. Physicists don't take such an oath. Engineers don't take such an oath. They have professional standards, but none of these bind them to making sure that they only do good. And I believe we have to bind them when they are young, right? Not leave it until later on when they're making pots of money out of producing nasty industrial chemicals. So we need to get our science worldwide back to an ethical basis, which it has quite abandoned. We need to educate our kids in how to choose non-toxic products. And fortunately, there are new apps arriving on your phone and things like that, where you can scrutinize things in the supermarket and find out what's in them and are they safe or not to eat. So the information is becoming more and more accessible. But it's difficult to get, I admit that, especially if you go out and really try to clean up your lifestyle. It's a terribly big ask. But the information is now coming forward, and there's heaps and heaps of organizations, the Breast Cancer Foundation, all the people who are interested in cleaning up cosmetics and personal care products. There's hundreds of websites worldwide about clean and healthy food now. So this information is starting to flood out there. And we just need to incorporate it in our education system and in what parents teach their children. Don't pick that because it's got preservatives in it. Eat fresh. Don't take that particular thing because it's got industrial dye in it made from coal. The cheese in that hamburger is bright yellow because it's been dyed with coal. Avoid those foods which basically are not good for you. We need to reward industry by buying green. The industries that do this. At the moment, green chemistry makes up only 0.002 of all the chemicals sold on Earth. That's how small. It is a tiny, tiny proportion of all the chemicals sold on Earth. The rest of them come out of the big, dirty, toxic process. So, we need to convert the chemical industry to green chemistry. They can see the opportunities in it, but there are no economic signals telling them to do it yet. And we have to create those signals by choosing, when we go into the shops, the things that are safe and clean and green. We should test all chemical products for safety. This should be mandated worldwide. We need an inventory. First of all, there isn't one. There isn't a world inventory of chemicals. Right, so we've got the IPCC keeping an eye on what's going on in the atmosphere, but we have got nobody like that keeping an eye on what's going on in this flood of chemicals, which is 5 times bigger than the harm we're causing the atmosphere. So we need an international body now, an intergovernmental body that regulates and monitors all of these chemicals and tries to identify which ones are really bad for us and should be got rid of. We've got the Stockholm Convention, but as I mentioned, only 19 chemicals have so far been banned, and there's 2,000 more being produced this year. So, that's a race we're never going to win at this rate. We need to ban all chemicals from coming on the market until they have been shown to be safe to humans, including especially children, and the wild, the environment generally. We need to clean up our food and our diet. The industrial system of agriculture that we've got is not going to last, okay? It's going to collapse around about the mid-century. There are 3 reasons for that. Primarily, first of all, we're losing water like you wouldn't believe. There is not enough water to grow the world's food any longer because the big cities have taken it from the farmers. Secondly, the soils are being eroded at a phenomenal rate. 75 billion tons of topsoil, as I mentioned earlier, are being lost every single year, cumulatively. That means half the world's farmland is going to be washed or blown away in the next 50 years, basically. So the world farmed area is going to decrease by half anyway. And thirdly, of course, climate. We can't stop the world going probably to 2 degrees or even 3 degrees by the middle of this century, and 4 degrees where agriculture becomes impossible by the end of the century. So we need a new way to produce food that is climate proof, doesn't use a lot of water, and doesn't use a lot of soil. And that is what I describe in my book, Food or War. Now, that system also purges the use of chemicals. We don't need to use chemicals to produce a large volume of wholesome, nutritious, sustainable food. Okay, so I described that process in the book. Some of it involves high technology, certainly. We can't do it all on small family farms, but we can feed the world well and without waste in a much better way than we are at the moment if we follow the prescription in Food or War. I'm happy to take questions on that if people want to ask more about it. But basically, renewable food, like renewable energy, is the key to a safe, sustainable human future. Now, I mentioned a right, the right. Every one of us in the world has a right to life, liberty, personal security, to marriage and family, to equality, work, education, to freedom of belief, to freedom from torture. These rights are available to all of us under the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. But to me, it is more than a little disturbing that there is no human right not to be poisoned. There's probably not a large number of people being tortured in the world at the moment, but we have a right not to be tortured, which can be invoked against any government. But there is no right not to be poisoned, and everybody is being poisoned, everybody at the moment. Unless and until we have such a right, there will probably never again be a day in history when we and our children are free from man-made poisons. Now, having a right doesn't mean that it abolishes the problem, but what it does is it raises the profile of the problem, and it starts to put enforcement agencies and public scrutiny on the companies or the individuals who may be perpetrating the poison. The chemical avalanche is 5 times larger than our climate emissions. It is here, and it's killing 13 million people a year. And yet it is not receiving a fraction of the public, government, and media attention that it deserves. I hope if you read Earth Detox, you will agree that this is a catastrophic threat to the human future, to the future of every single one of us alive today or to be born in the remainder of this century. It demands our understanding, our care, and our resolute action for the sake of all who come after us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Julian. That was a great presentation. Let's see. Okay, so before we start with the Q&A, where's the best place that people can find out about you and your books?
My latest 2 books were published by Cambridge University Press, the British academic publisher. So you can get them from their website, basically. On my own website, juliancribb.net, you can also find links to my other publications. Yep, you've got them there. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so thanks for sharing that. And now we're ready to start the live Q&A session. First, I just want to explain to everyone how we do this here. We normally don't take questions directly from the chat. Instead, we ask everyone to virtually raise your hand. If you're not sure how to do this, what you do is click on your reactions tab at the bottom of your Zoom window, then click on the raised hand function in that menu that pops up. So we will then take questions in order in which we receive them. When it's your turn, we'll unmute you and prompt you to ask your questions. And with that, are you ready to go, Julian?
I am.
Okay, great. So I haven't seen anyone yet, but give me 1 second. All right, so I have some questions for you, actually. So my first question is, tell us about the chapter in your book called Chemical Avalanche.
Well, basically, I just did in a way. I'm describing the total quantum of the chemicals that is being produced by human action. So that's not just what's being manufactured by big petrochemical plants and pharmaceutical companies and things like that. It's also all the chemicals that are being unleashed by human activity, such as farming, mining, building and construction, manufacturing, and things like that. We unleash only 1% of the or 2% of the chemicals that we actually release are deliberately, purposefully made chemicals. The rest of them are released more or less by accident, but they still have a chemical effect on us. So the dust from a ploughed field very often contains nasty substances that give you lung disease. The dust from a mine can certainly give you lung disease. So there's an enormous quantum of stuff that the human beings have stirred up like a busy mob of insects, and transported around the planet. And it's traveling back and forth. And we know now, air pollution used to be a problem that occurred in big cities. But places like London and New York and so on. But now air pollution travels around the world in a river. There's a big brown, horrible stain of a cloud that just flows round and round the middle latitudes of the Northern Hemisphere. Just all that pollution from all of those different industries and countries. And everybody's inhaling that. So you just can't get away from this stuff.
Thank you for that. Also, please tell us why you wrote the Earth Detox, how and why we must clean up our planet.
Yeah, well, basically, I was working with a large number of scientists who were, they were working on how you clean up contaminated sites. So you might have an old petrol refinery, or you might have a chemical plant, or even an old dry cleaning agency, or a fuel station or something like that. And the chemicals had leached into the soil, and how do you clean up that mess? And there's a thing called the Superfund in the United States where people do attempt to clean up these things. But talking to these scientists and attending their international conferences, and then talking to Indian scientists and Chinese scientists and Swiss scientists and German scientists, it came to me that this is a worldwide problem, and we're attempting to solve these little local scale disasters, which are mere pixels in this much, much bigger picture. So it was just borne in on me over the years that I worked with these scientists that this was much larger, more. You can't just put a chain link fence around a polluted site and keep the pollution in there. It gets out. It gets out on the water, the wind, and the soil, and so on. And so it travels around the planet. So we are now talking about a worldwide problem, bigger than climate change, and in the end, more insidious. It's certainly killing 10 times more people than climate change at the moment. That may not always be the case. But at the moment, chemical poisoning is killing 10 times the number of people that climate disasters are killing. By the middle of the century, climate disasters may have caught up. But at the moment, this is the most deadly thing that humans have ever done to one another.
Thank you for that, Julian. Thank you. So now we have questions coming in. So, okay, first question is Kaylee. Kaylee, what is your question?
Hello. Please, can you tell me, is part of the World Health Organization, as formally as part of the United Nations addressing this, have they taken it out, or has UNICEF adopted, have these different arms of the United Nations taken this on to address it? And is there a way for the Secretary General of the United Nations to involve and along with having a group of scientists who will look after this, to whom the different countries will be responsible for doing, for creating a program that people such as you would monitor and create? Has this been brought up?
Not so far as I know. The UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, does quite a lot of work in this area. And of course, the World Health Organization is monitoring what is going on with human health. But nobody has yet put together the big picture. That's really why I wrote the book, because everybody's looking at the individual pixels or the individual pieces of this jigsaw puzzle. Nobody is looking at the big picture. So the whole purpose of writing the book was to draw international policy attention and international scientific attention to a very big problem for humanity that needs to be addressed with all the urgency, with more urgency, in fact, because of the death toll, even than climate change. Now, with climate change, what you have is the IPCC, an intergovernmental organization. It's a government organization, not a scientific organization, but it brings together the best science on Earth to study the climate problem. And that has dramatically improved our understanding of the climate problem. We need a chemical, IPCC, basically, to understand what is the effect of the mass release of 220 billion tons of chemicals every year, cumulative, year after year after year after year. Every 5 years, 1 trillion tons of chemicals are unleashed by human activity, and they don't go away. They mix and they intermingle and they release daughter products. And there is nobody studying that, nobody in science that I know of. I mean, in science, they're barely up to counting the number of man-made chemicals. And they're only just starting out studying the mixtures problem. So we need a huge worldwide effort to comprehend what is going on here as a matter of urgency. And as I say, the death toll alone justifies it. It's the most deadly thing that humans have ever done to one another, is to unleash these. So at the moment, it's not being recognized, but the UN World Health Organization is keeping tabs on it. They are telling us what the death toll is. They're watching how many people die of air pollution, how many people die of different cancers, how many people die of different other related diseases. They're studying with alarm the worldwide increase in mental diseases, in depression, in suicide, and in autism and ADHD, and all of these childhood mental diseases that are now sort of starting to manifest themselves, that weren't there when I was a child growing up, or if they were there at very, very low levels in the population. These things have flowered dramatically in the last 30 or 40 years, and that has been the time of maximum human chemical output. So, basically there's a smoke and fire issue here. We can see the smoke. When are we going to get to addressing the fire?
Could the press, international press, be given these books, your books, and for a massive international review of the book and brought up that way? I know my sister's a journalist in Italy, in Rome, where there is an International Press Association, La Stampa Estera, and they would be like one group. But what about in the United States? I don't know. Is there an international press group? Could your book be given to the reviewers of the most important and publicized newspapers to read and review, and attention brought that way?
I have to say that, the book has been distributed by my publisher, Cambridge University Press. It's been offered to leading media in the United States. I have to say they're not interested. America is a totally chemicalized society. You've got to realize that. It's run by the chemistry industry. Almost everything Americans do or touch contains chemicals, and, it's not in the interests of that big industry for there to be too much public exposure of these issues. And the media are sheep. Look, I say this with a great deal of shame and sorrow, because I've been a journalist since the early 1970s. I've been a newspaper editor for years, but my profession has gone down the tubes. They are not interested. They are not trained. Even among journalists, there are very, very few journalists actually qualified to report on science or who know anything about science. They know a lot about economics, so-called, and they know a lot about politics. They know heaps about entertainment. The media is not really about information. It's about entertainment, which is why you've got, Fox News and Co. making so much money from publishing garbage. So, basically, the media is in a bad way, and democracy and the Western world in particular are being betrayed by that, because the media does not provide people with the information they need to have when they go to vote for their next government, unfortunately. Or they're looking very, very short term. They're not looking at the long term. But personally, I find it horrifying that we can be committing an act of mass manslaughter on the scale, twice the scale of World War II, and nobody notices. What is wrong with us?
I wonder if your book were wrapped in a bright red cover upon which was written, "You are being poisoned." And that book was distributed amongst Costco and BJ's and all the discount places where people go shopping, and the same kind of stores in different countries, if that wouldn't catch people's attention.
Well, I think, yeah, sure, it would be great. As I say, my book is probably written more for the policymakers, the thinkers, the people who really want to clean up their act, the people who are, it's written for concerned grandparents such as myself, who are worried what kind of a toxic world we are handing off to our grandchildren. I think the average person is starting to get their information from sources such as the other speakers at this conference, from concerned doctors who are saying, look, I'm seeing this horrible disease, rampaging around the place, and, here's how to fix it. Here's what's causing it, and here's how to fix it. So this knowledge is percolating through society. And I actually put more faith in social media these days, even though there's a lot of garbage on social media. But there's also good stuff on social media, very reliable stuff on social media. So, social media is a source of tremendous hope to me, because people are starting to exchange ideas about how we fix these gigantic problems. And that exchange is taking place worldwide. That's the really nice thing about it. For the first time in the whole of our history as a species on Earth, we are exchanging ideas around the planet. We're starting to think together as a species.
Well, then there is hope.
There is hope.
Maybe in addition on the book, it should be written for all grandparents. I too am one.
It is certainly, all my books are written for thinking grandparents, yeah, who really now are starting to understand what they have done to the world without appreciating it. What our numbers and our enormous consumptive processes have done to this planet, which are going to make it uninhabitable. Now, we're going to turn it back into what it was 800 million years ago if we are not careful.
Yes.
So but there is time to put the brakes on that process. I'm not saying that we will stop all pain. There will probably be a crash, within the next 10, 20, 30 years. But we can minimize the damage that does. We can cut the number of deaths and the amount of human suffering that produces.
I hope so. Thank you so much for all your effort and your wisdom and your heart and your mind being united. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kaylee. So I just want to tell everyone, if you guys would like to also participate in this meeting, you can go to the reactions tab at the bottom of your Zoom window, hit the raise hand icon, and we'll see your hand pop up, and then we'll call on you. Aside from that, Julian, I'm going to ask you another question on, on the topic of your book. Can you please explain to us a chapter in your book called Poisoning a Planet?
Yeah, well, basically, I'm just describing there how all the chemicals that we have unleashed are moving around the world. They're in the air and in water, particularly. So when you have a mine, and it digs up all that rock and that soil and things like to get at the ore, basically, that a lot of that ends up in the river, and the river ends up cloudy and turgid and polluted, and the fish die. And the water is undrinkable, and acidic runoff, starts to flow out of the mine dumps, the dumps of spoils and things that are left over after the mine. I mean, there's a mine in California, which basically is still going to be emitting acid runoff for 3,000 years, after the mine closed. It closed in the 1960s, but it's still pouring out poison. So these are the sort of things that we've unleashed, which we don't really understand. We don't understand that a lot of the corals, that are dying in Australia, they're dying because the cattle grazing the inland loosed the topsoil. The inland was overgrazed, the topsoil got into the rivers, came flushing down with each large rain every season, and then the sediment went out onto the reef and it buried the corals, and the corals died, basically. So all the inshore corals in Australia are pretty well gone now. because of sedimentary runoff, because of soil erosion, because of what you saw in the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. Now, this humans just hammering the ground, mobilizing all that dirt. It's happening all over Africa at the moment. It's terrifying, the amount of erosion that's taking place, especially as we introduce, as Bill Gates introduces, modern American-style agriculture to Africa. It's going to multiply the amount of soil erosion and damage to water and wildlife and things like that in Africa. So, poor old Africa is going to go the same way. These systems are not sustainable. They were a short-term stopgap solution to a problem, but we have to go to a sustainable food system from now on. So poisoning a planet was really about the mobility of these chemicals. That once you produce something, it doesn't just sit still. When you produce some mercury, when you burn coal to generate your electricity, the coal gases go up the chimney, but they contain mercury. Now they come down in the middle of the ocean, and the swordfish that you get to eat, contains high levels of mercury, which has been bioconcentrated up the food chain in the ocean. The polar bears in the Arctic have increasingly high levels of mercury caused by coal burning for power generation in Western society and in China and things like that. So, the mercury is highly mobile. It can go up into the atmosphere, it can flow through these food chains, and it can concentrate, particularly in human beings. And that is why when ladies get pregnant nowadays, their doctor says to them, don't eat fish, because it contains too much mercury, because the fish bioconcentrate the mercury that we release. So that mercury can be released by burning coal, it can be released by mining gold, it can be released by a host of used to be released from our fillings in our teeth, from a whole lot of processes. Basically, toxic mercury is released into the environment and it comes back to us in the food chain. But that in a snapshot is what we. I call this the anthropogenic chemical circulation, because it is an entire process. It's bigger than the ocean currents. It's a worldwide current in which toxins are being distributed around the planet. And we've got to start getting a scientific handle on it. At the moment, we have no scientific handle on it. Basically, we know little bits of it. Our knowledge of the global chemical circulation is back where our understanding of climate change was in the 1960s. And we need to advance that very rapidly.
Very frightening indeed. Also, we have one person now. Oh, Benny. Benny, what would you like to ask a question for Julian Cribb?
Thank you. Great presentation. What is the potential of biomass, and especially hemp biomass, to replace or to be used for fuels? And does that really reduce the amount of carbon, or is it just a different type of carbon that's ultimately burned?
Okay, well, any kind of biomass, if burned, is carbon neutral if you're using it for fuel, because the carbon you release when you burn it is absorbed by the growing of the plant, whatever the plant happens to be. It doesn't matter whether it's hemp or any other high yield or high mass crop. The problem is that if you try to produce your fuel agriculturally, you also destroy topsoil. Inevitably, you unleash topsoil. You use water that you would use for some other purpose. And we know that places like California, China, and India are running out of water. We can't. So agricultural systems for producing fuel, are not terribly sensible any longer. They used to be. And there are still certain agricultural wastes, like, bagasse from sugarcane, which can be used to heat the process that is used to refine sugar. That's a sensible use of an agricultural waste. But by and large, ploughing up good country, which ought to be returned to nature in order to drive motor cars is a nutty idea any longer, especially we now know we can drive our cars on the sun or on the wind, you know, with big batteries and, you know, Elon Musk and co. You know, we're moving over to electric vehicles at a phenomenal rate around the world. And I would think that by 2030 anyway, you know, there'll be enormous mobility, electrification of the transport system. So you won't really need liquid fuels all that much. Some people are promoting green hydrogen as an alternative transport fuel for, say, big trucks and trains and so forth. But, you know, if you like farming alternatives, I'll tell you one that still is looking very promising, and that's algae farming. You know, you can grow algae almost anywhere you don't want them. You know, that slimy green stuff in your dam or your pond or your river. But basically, you can extract oil from almost any kind of algae. And there's been a lot of really good science done on that in the United States and elsewhere. So, I mean, you could literally squeeze the algae, extract the oil, and whack it into your four-wheel drive and drive away. So it's, you know, algae is potentially a useful source of transport fuels if you need one.
Thank you for that, Benny, for that question. Also, Julian, can you explain to our audience your chapter in your book called Sick Society?
Yeah, well, that's basically this phenomenal increase in a whole lot of diseases that were almost unknown when I was growing up in the 1950s and 60s. So we're talking particularly brain diseases or developmental diseases in young children. You know, the worldwide surge in autism and ADHD, and a whole lot of other diseases that are related to that. Particularly diseases affecting gender, sexuality, and reproductive potential. The loss of fertility in both males and females is a worldwide phenomenon now, and it all coincides with this avalanche of chemicals that have been unleashed on us since the mid-1970s. But, you know, there's a statistic that is even more alarming, and that is that according to 7 scientific studies that I've seen so far, the human IQ, human intelligence, is now declining at a rate of about 3 points per decade. Okay, so we're becoming dumber and dumber and dumber as we go along. And the only possible explanation for this is the global flood of nerve poisons, neurotoxins, that is being unleashed by global chemistry. The brain damage is being done in the womb and in early childhood, which is when the brain develops. I mean, the brain absorbs almost everything you put into it, which is why we like to smoke weed and drink alcohol and things like that, because we get a high straight away. That's why people take drugs. But to be honest with you, you know, if you do that to a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, you damage their intelligence for life. And that's what we're doing. So the human IQ has actually decreased. Now get this, it's decreased 13 points since 1975, according to these studies. That means humans have gone from being 100 points average down to 87 points. If you look in the average jail, the IQ is about 85. So we've reduced the human intelligence to very nearly that of a jail inmate, a typical jail inmate. And, you know, that's this is a disaster. It's a disaster for democracy. It means that people no longer have the mental capacity to understand the issues that they are being asked to vote upon. And we've seen that in elections in the United States, Australia, Britain, and elsewhere. People just don't get what it's about any longer. They're driven by these fantasy beliefs and fictions and, you know, all sorts of imagination. They're driven by misinformation, disinformation, a whole lot of lies and bullshit. They don't have the intellectual equipment any longer to tell the difference between truth and fiction. So consequently, they're voting that way as well. And you can't have a democracy if people are brain damaged. And unfortunately, we're brain damaging people at this phenomenal rate. What is causing it precisely? It's not one thing or another. It's the whole mess of things. It's air pollution. It's what's coming out of your sofa. It's what's coming out of the plastic in your environment. It's what's coming out of the dashboard of your motor car. So all of these things, you're inhaling them every moment. They're going into your blood, they're going into your brain. I've mentioned how a baby now, the first poo it takes when it comes out of its mother's womb is full of plastic, because tiny plastic, i.e. petroleum particles, have entered its mother's bloodstream, during her pregnancy, and that child is already contaminated. It's already being brain damaged by the chemicals carried by those plastic particles, microparticles. And we're doing more and more of it. So we're doing nanotechnology is the release of micro scale particles. And nobody has any idea at all what the gross health effects of this are going to be. But we're licensing, not even licensing, we're releasing new nano products, almost every week. Sporting equipment, socks, you name it, nano socks. There's always this techno babble about how wonderful nano is, and yet nano can get anywhere in your body, and it can have a toxic effect anywhere in your body, your brain, your liver, your pancreas, your kidneys. It can get there, and nobody is doing a thing to stop it. There is no regulation to prevent nanotechnology from creating a whole rank of new diseases. So we're going to see a whole bunch of new diseases that have never been seen before. In fact, we're already seeing them. And doctors are getting frustrated because a patient walks in saying, "Doctor, I don't feel good. I've got this symptom. I've got headaches and blurred vision and what have you, and night sweats and things like that." The doctor says, "Oh, it's all in your mind, so I'll give you some psychotherapeutic drugs." So this patient who is poisoned by the outpourings of the petrochemical industry is then given a product from the petrochemical industry to treat the disease. How sick is that?
Yep, it's like putting a Band-Aid over a cannonball wound, right?
It's probably less effective than that.
Yeah, I agree. All right, next we have Laura. Laura, what is your question?
So thank you for doing this. There's 144 people right now engaged in this conversation, and I'm sure we all feel the weight of it. While you were speaking, I already went to your website. I already sent you an email asking you if you're available to do some sort of an interview to give this presentation in my local area, because I think we can all agree that forget the media. The media is not going to help us. Governments are not going to help us. We're on our own. And unless we get this information onto the local level, people they're too busy. They're not going to read books. They're just trying to make ends meet. But we all have libraries, and we all have high schools, and we all have venues that we can use to invite every single speaker that we've heard to give these presentations to our localities. And I think that's at least one tool that we all have that we can use. And I look forward to hearing from you after you read my email. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Laura. And you're describing precisely the process by which we're going to fix this problem. It is by thinking globally and acting locally. And I give talks all the time to small local groups. I gave one the other week to a bunch of urban gardeners and farmers in New York. Here I am in Canberra, Australia. And this is the wonder of the internet.
Yes.
This is the most important. This internet thing is the most important development in human evolution ever. It's because it enables us to join minds, share ideas, exchange experience and wisdom across an entire planet. For the first time in history, we would have had to have a very labored correspondence involving letters and sailing ships, 100 years ago or 150 years ago. So ideas traveled very slowly. Now they can travel at the speed of light, and they can be validated. They can be checked out by science. So we know the difference between a good idea, a truthful idea, a tested idea, and one that is frankly bullshit. So, we know we know a lot better what's real and what isn't. So, yes, by acting locally, by having kitchen table conversations, by forming small groups of urban guerrilla gardeners and setting up fresh, clean food supplies on your street, all of these types of activities, by forming mothers groups, How do we cleanse our house of toxins so that our babies may be raised in a healthy environment? You know, all of these things are starting to happen. And the wonder of it is, as I say, it's not just Americans talking to Americans, it's Aussies, Americans, Japanese, Britons, Swiss, you know, South Africans, Koreans. We're all having this conversation together, you know, and that's a very exciting moment. And I want to just ask you to imagine when a baby is in the second trimester of a pregnancy, a wonderful thing happens. The neurons and the glia and the axons in the infant brain join up, and a blob of cells suddenly becomes a being capable of rational thought, sentience, imagination, feeling, and dreams. And at that moment, it becomes a human being. Now, this is starting to happen. This is starting to happen on a worldwide scale. We are joining up thoughts and ideas like the neurons in the infant brain. We are hooking up in real time, and ideas are being transmitted around the planet among millions and millions of us. And eventually, we're all going to be online by the end of this decade. Everybody on Earth is going to be online. So the capacity to have a human-wide conversation about these things and to take your brilliant local idea globally within 24 hours is going to be with us. Now, the downside to that is that there's an awful lot of, you know, rubbish and bullshit and misinformation that's being traded on the internet as well. We have to be wise consumers. We have to understand the difference between truth and fiction. We have to know the difference between science and belief. And, you know, once we've trained ourselves to do that, and that's no harder than training yourself to go into a fruit market and choose good fruit as opposed to rotten fruit. Now, you've got to be able to choose, you know, good fruit from rotten fruit when you walk in the market. Same on the internet and social media. Choose the good stuff, share the good stuff.
Thank you, Laura, for that comment. Next, we have Benny again. Benny, what's your question?
Thank you again. What about, what is the potential for recycling garbage or agricultural waste? We see trees cut down, all that wood is just put into landfills or whatever. What is the potential to recycle and recover waste, especially agricultural waste, for anything better than just polluting?
It's absolutely huge, Benny. It is huge. Now, I want to put this really in perspective. My background, I'm not a scientist. I'm a scholar of classical literature, believe it or not. And I studied Homer when I was at university. And in the Odyssey, which was written 3,000 years ago, it describes the moment when Odysseus comes home and he sees his old dog. He's been gone for 20 years at the Trojan War and lost in the Mediterranean. And he sees his old dog. The dog's been waiting and it's been thrown out and it's been sitting on the dung heap outside the door of the house. And the dung heap was the thing that it says in the Odyssey that the men forked back onto the paddock every year after winter, right? So in the old days, and this goes right up until the 19th century, people took all their agricultural waste and their kitchen waste and they put it back on the fields, right? And, you know, the Chinese collected the night soil and they put it on the rice fields. So we recycled our nutrients. And then a couple of gentlemen called Haber and Bosch came along, German chemists, and invented, you know, nitrogen fertilizer, and people discovered urea and so forth. And suddenly we began a system of agriculture that is based entirely on waste, right? It's based on mining the resource, spreading it on the paddock, and then wasting 90% of it before it gets to the human being. Okay, so agriculture is a system of total waste, modern agriculture. Traditional agriculture, much less so, because it recycles its nutrients. Now, if humanity wants to feed itself in the long run, it has to recycle nutrients. The easiest way to do that is via the cities, because cities are enormous catchments for nutrients, right? So a city like New York, a city like London, a city like Sydney, you know, it catches food from all over the world and transforms it into poo or waste. And it either goes down the sewer pipe into the ocean somewhere, or it goes into the landfill. So all those precious nutrients, the very things that keep us alive, are wasted. If we catch them, and we can catch them, we can catch them at innumerable points, and there are lots of cities, including my own in Canberra, where we recycle all our kitchen and garden waste now. So all the clippings that I take off my veggies and things like that, they go into the green bin, and that gets turned into compost, and that compost gets reused on urban farms and gardens, food gardens. So urban food production, as opposed to broadacre agricultural food production, can actually recycle all the nutrients that we currently waste. And it can recycle water, guess what? And it doesn't take a lot of land. You can produce 10 times the volume of food from an area, from a hydroponic farm, or aquaponic farm, or some other concentrated, or even an Impossible Burger farm or something like that. You can produce a very high volume of food in a small area in a city on top of a building. And guess what? That food is climate proof, right? So no amount of hailstorms or droughts or floods is going to damage that food production system. So these big sky farms that people are now talking about, that Jeff Bezos has been talking about, and others, that is a major answer to the world food problem. You put one of those into Nairobi or Niger or any of the African countries, you've solved the local food problem. They're putting them into Dubai, for example. Now, Dubai is a desert country, right? It doesn't do farming. There's now a 50-story sky farm going in Dubai, and it's going to turn out 250,000 airline meals for Emirates Airlines every single day. So, places that never used to be farming country are going to learn to produce food, may not by farming techniques, but this is one of the most exciting developments that's going on. And this food can be produced without chemicals, and just simply, as I say, without fertilizer, because you're recycling the nutrients again and again and again, reusing them. Because nutrients aren't destroyed; they're simply lost, and our present system wastes colossally. And another dimension of this is that we are polluting the earth with nitrogen fertilizer. If you look at the boundaries of the earth chart that Johan Rockstrom and his crew have developed, the boundary that has been far exceeded, beyond the climate boundary, beyond the extinction boundary and things like that, the one that is worst of all is the pollution of the planet with nitrogen, because that causes those dead spots in the ocean that I mentioned, the pollution of rivers. It's toxic for people when it gets into their groundwater and they drink it. It causes all sorts of diseases, blue babies and what have you. So we are polluting the earth with a concentration of nitrogen that was not there in the natural system.
Would you agree? Would you agree with me that this whole business, and Elon Musk is in the news, he's a great guy, but going to Mars is kind of silly business? Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, look, he's a rich man. Rich men have hobbies. They have race horses, spaceships. You can't really stop them having mad ideas. I mean, to be honest with you, I prefer Gates's style, because Gates at least cares about what's happening to the kids in Africa. And I care about what's happening to the kids in Africa, because what's happening to the kids in Africa is going to happen to the kids in Europe and America in the latter part of this century. Take it from me. We're all going to be facing famine if we don't fix the world food problem. So fixing the world food problem is important. Where I don't agree with Mr. Gates is that the American system of chemicals and fertilizers and high tech and cloning things and genetic engineering is the way to go. There are other much cleaner, safer, more sustainable ways to produce food. So Mr. Musk is entertaining himself. He's a man with a sense of humor. Look, he's never going to be able to settle Mars in any worthwhile sense that more than a handful of people could live on it. They're probably going to get blown out by the cosmic radiation, if they try and stay there very long, unless they spend their entire lives underground. And if they spend their entire lives underground on Mars, what's the difference between that and living in a nuclear bunker on Earth, on a devastated Earth? No, we need to address all 10 of the threats that I've written about in all of my books, all 10 of them, okay? One of them is nuclear war. And, we're in a very alarming situation with the risk of nuclear war breaking out over the Ukraine at the moment. We do not want to go there. We need to ban all nuclear weapons. We need to end the production of fossil fuels, climate change. We need to end this poisoning of the planet. So there's a lot of things that we need to do on our agenda. Otherwise, we're not going to save human civilization.
Thank you, Benny, for that. Julian, you've been giving us a lot of great solutions to all these effects. Is that also what's written in your chapter, Preventing Catastrophe? What's outlined in that chapter?
Well, basically, we've got to put the brakes on. We've got to put the brakes on this chemical outpouring because it's a much bigger problem than we ever thought it was. And it's slipped in under the radar. It's relied upon the claim that chemical X, if you ingest it in very, very small amounts, does not appear to have any toxic effects. And that is a bullshit argument, okay? It's a dishonest argument. It's an alchemist's argument. That argument was put forward in the 15th century, right, by an alchemist. And it's still being used by the chemical industry today to defend itself. So, once you release a chemical, it intermingles with other chemicals. It interacts with those other chemicals. It releases daughter chemicals, some of which may be more toxic than the original chemical. So we just don't know. But at the moment, we're releasing millions of these things willy-nilly in billions of tons. So, we're creating this chemical soup on our planet. No species has ever done that. Life on Earth nearly came to a halt 2 billion years ago when the blue-green algae, which were the only form of life on Earth in those days, basically produced so much of this very poisonous substance called oxygen that they almost killed themselves. So the entire world was inhabited in those days only by creatures that live in your compost heap, basically, or in your pond, the bottom of your pond, anoxic bacteria. And they excrete oxygen. So the oxygen levels in the atmosphere build up and up and up. And you've got a thing called the oxygen holocaust, in which all these species of microbes started dying out. But then some of them evolved to cope with the higher level of oxygen. This took hundreds of millions of years, but they did. And from that moment onwards, once that got in the ocean, all the other evolution that has occurred on Earth started. It started up 800 million years ago, when single-celled organisms became multi-celled organisms, became things that swam and crawled and flew. Basically, that's where everything came from, oxygen in the oceans. But we're in the process of turning the clock back to the anoxic ocean, to what they call a Canfield Ocean. And that's a very frightening possibility. Now, our oceans are already being stripped of their oxygen. There are signs the currents are starting to break down, so you're not going to get the mixing between the oxygen-rich surface layers and the deep layers. So we could be heading for another Permian-style extinction, which was the worst extinction event in Earth history, if we're not very careful. And it starts with this overflow of nutrients, basically, which triggers the process. So, we're in a very delicate state here. And humans are responsible because our numbers are far too great. I mean, candidly, according to the scientific estimates, many of them that I've read, we've currently got a population about 4 times larger than the Earth can carry at the levels of consumption that we have in our society, right? So a sustainable Earth population would be around about 2 billion people. So think about that at the moment. Think about cattle in a paddock, in a field. Think about putting 800 cattle in a field that will only carry 200. And think about what happens. Every farmer will tell you what happens if you put 800 cattle where you can only feed 200. That's what we've done to the planet. And we're going to reap the consequences unless we start putting the brakes on things, fairly quickly.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Julian. We really appreciate you coming here and answering all our questions and doing your presentation. Really, and also last night too, the panel was very, very good, very eye-opening. So we just want to thank you for coming to our conference. And also, what does everyone else want to say? Does anyone else want to say anything to Julian Cribb?
Exactly.